Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming to our discussion of Laura. It will be moderated by Jacob Mazer, our special programming manager, and myself. A few things to keep in mind. Please keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question. Otherwise, everyone will hear everything that's happening where you are, just like you did with us a few minutes ago. Also, you can raise your hand to ask a question. As you can see on the screen, there's a raise your hand function within Zoom, and that's a great way to let us know you have a question, and then one of us will call on you. If you are a little shy and want to put your question in chat, our colleague Jill will be asking the questions that come through on chat, so you can do that too. But we'd prefer to hear from you directly if you don't mind raising your hand. In addition, you can also add comments in general to the group or introduce yourself in the chat window if you were so interested. When you do ask a question by speaking, it would be great if you could say your name because not necessarily everybody will see who's speaking. I guess that's about it. Jacob and I have a few points we want to sort of ask about to get things rolling. But other than that, let's get started. So Jacob, you want to start us off?
Sure thing. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. And I hope you enjoyed the film. One thing that I thought might be a good place to start is, we heard from a number of you prior to this discussion saying that Laura was one of your favorite films. And I'm wondering if any of you who wrote in to say that are here with us tonight, or even if you didn't, but you feel that way about the film, whether you'd be willing to share, about what makes this film special to you, what stands out to you.
I might need to allow people to talk. Hold on. You can chat though right now.
Well, I don't see any hands raised.
Okay.
They should be able to raise hands.
Maybe no one wants to. Oh, there we go.
Here we go.
We've
got some people in here.
Fabiano, would you care to share your thoughts on that question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Fabiano.
Hi, how are you? I think the question was, could you repeat the question if you don't mind?
Well, I know, what makes this film special to you? What stands out?
Okay. I'm gonna be honest, the first time I saw this film was, I think it was about 23 years ago. And I was absolutely just mesmerized by it. The lighting, just the way the film was shot. And I mean, I hope this is okay. I mean, I thought Jean Tierney was just absolutely just stunning in the film, the way they, her outfits, her costumes, and just the way they shot her. I mean, she looked just unbelievable in black and white. And the way she played off Dana Andrews was, I thought, really, really well done. I don't know. I love the film, and I've loved it ever since.
Okay, thank you. Roseanne, you had a thought on the same question. Fabiano, could you mute yourself? Thank you. Roseanne, did you have a comment on the same question? Roseanne, are you there? Okay, well, I guess we can come back to Roseanne since we can't hear her right now. Susan, did you have a response to Jacob's first question?
Unmute. Okay. Yeah, a small question. I thought it was interesting that in this film, they started off with the murderer, clearly giving him the most time. And usually they're not as blatant about who the main suspect should be.
What impression did that make on you, Susan? What struck you about that?
Well, usually I like to solve the mystery as I go along. There I thought, well, why is he getting so much time and he seems so obsessed with her? If he's not the murderer, I'd be very surprised.
Yeah.
So it didn't give me much time to figure it out. It wasn't very Agatha Christie.
Well, you brought up a couple interesting points there, and I see some other good questions on the chat too. But one thing that you brought up was that, you know, the film starts with Waldo, and it's sort of unusual that he gets as much time as he does. I mean, he really probably has probably a third of the movie or a quarter of the movie is his account of his firsthand account of his, you know, relationship with Laura. You know, and he almost is right in the bathtub, and he's almost a main character for a portion of the film. I mean, the main character shifts a little bit as we go through this film, doesn't it? What struck you guys about Waldo? You know, when you meet him, what did you make of him?
The fact that we meet him in the bathtub?
We have to mention that, don't we?
Right.
Nilmini, am I saying that right? Did you have a comment response to Jacob's question? Okay. See, I find it interesting that Susan said that she automatically knew or assumed that Waldo was the killer, because I didn't. I thought there were a few good candidates as the film unfolded, and I didn't take the fact that he was featured so prominently in the beginning as an indication either way that he was or wasn't. But I think what all these sorts of points kind of point to is that this film isn't so much about the mystery. And frankly, I think if we stop and think about the elements of the crime, so to speak, the movie kind of becomes less impressive and less impactful. This isn't a movie, I think, that has earned its fans and its plaudits based on its sharp plotting. I think it's more about other things that people have alluded to, whether it's the atmosphere or the characterizations or even the structure of the story, which was a bone of contention when the novel was being turned into a film, and is frankly one of the more unusual elements of it.
I see some. I'm looking through the chat, and I see some good comments about Waldo in here too. You know, his fastidiousness, his debonair sensibility, his narcissism. A number of people have commented on his first appearance in the bathtub too. You know, which is a kind of a unique way to, you know, greet a murder detective.
I mean, I think, and I see some questions and hands up, and we'll get to those in just a sec. I just want to say that I think it's pretty clear in the sort of film vernacular of the time, that we are intended to question Waldo's heterosexuality.
Right.
We know that he is at least ostensibly heterosexual because of the way he seems to take something resembling a romantic interest in Laura, though I think it's certainly not conventional, at least not by Hollywood standards in that sense. Also, frankly, the fact that he is so comfortable exposing himself to Detective McPherson so early on, you know, automatically raises that question. But this is a topic I can imagine a lot of different opinions on. Cheryl, do you have a comment on this point?
Well, first of all, just Clifton Webb. He's just doing a Clifton Webb that he usually is, including the cane and the very fastidious dressing and everything else. But my main comment is what I find attractive and probably the most compelling part of the movie is the theme, the Laura song, which has plays throughout. It sets her up as this incredible character, and then of course she appears. And I wonder how popular or whatever this movie would be if it wasn't for that absolutely haunting music.
I mean, it's certainly is an element of the film that stands out, and I think that maybe this is the point that we can come back to in a few minutes, because I know a lot of people had comments about the score. Going back to Clifton Webb and Waldo, it's really interesting because this was Clifton Webb's first film since 1930. He hadn't made a movie in the sound era before this one. And then, of course, after making this film and playing this part, which, as Cheryl said, was really sort of classic Clifton Webb, he ends up playing this basic versions of this character moving forward. But that being said, in casting Clifton Webb, they knew that they were going to make this character a certain sort, come across as a certain sort of man, and that in and of itself, I think probably complicates the dynamic a little bit.
Yeah, let me just add to that by saying, one thing that we know from, the history is that Preminger really sought out Clifton Webb, and he really had to lean on Darryl F. Zanuck, the producer, to cast him, because he had, been a stage actor for exclusively a stage actor for more than 10 years at that time. So, Webb's affect was one that Preminger was, really looking for. Do we have more hands? Can you see
Charles had a hand up.
Well, one thing that kind of bothered me was the number of times that they did play the theme song, including the time that I think Clifton Webb was hiding or kind of peering around his shoulder to hear what the other folks were talking about. I think I counted 4 times that it was played, which it's a good theme, but it didn't seem to carry that well for me.
Zach, did you have a response to what Charles was saying?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Zach.
Fantastic. Yeah. I'm a college student. I actually study film scoring. So personally, I felt the theme was underused because, basically at that point, the film score was really just coming into its own, and Korngold and Steiner had just emerged on the scene like 5 years previously. But the big process of that era was the leitmotifs based off of Wagner, like a character has a theme. And so because Lars, like the central point of the film, I really felt the theme was underused because like she had so many pivotal and powerful scenes that I really thought the theme should have been used more.
That's interesting, and I have to say that that's not a comment I typically hear about movies from this era, that there wasn't enough music. I think perhaps it speaks a bit to your particular area of interest and expertise, but it's a very interesting perspective and not one that I hear very much. Richard, you had a comment or question.
I don't know how to get his attention.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Roseanne, are you back?
Bobby.
Roseanne? No. Okay. Then let's try Jonathan.
Yes,
Oh, here I am.
oh, that's not me, but okay. Oh, that is also not me, but I am related.
Hi there.
Not I. I want a couple of comments. Get back to the Clifton Webb's character Waldo. And then, as I've listened to this discussion, I wonder if there isn't some variant or element of a Pygmalion character. I was thinking Svengali, but it's more Pygmalion. This sort of mentor, creator, falling in love with his creation. but taken another step further into a point of obsession and mania. A couple of other comments unrelated to that. I was reminded at times of a couple of other murder mystery detective movies, in particular, The Big Sleep. This sort of, everyman detective immersed in this milieu of wealth and sophistication that he may understand but doesn't quite fit in. And as in that film, the mystery almost doesn't matter, except in The Big Sleep, nobody can figure it out.
Yeah.
But it's more about the characters and the style and the relationships. And even in The Big Sleep, the relationship between Bogey and Bacall, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but she was a suspect as much as Laura was. And the detective clearly was smitten by her. So I think there are some real parallels there. I guess that's what I have to say.
I think those are great points, Jonathan. And Jacob, I know in your introduction you mentioned some films that this one, I won't necessarily say influence is too strong, but that sort of calls to mind. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that, because there's one that jumps out to me, in part based on what Jonathan was saying.
Absolutely. So, and Jonathan, you made a number of interesting comments. There are a couple significant works that, seem to be inspired by Laura, or at least sort of in dialogue with Laura. One of them being Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, which arrived about a decade later. Another film with a sort of obsession and a sort of rupture that takes place in the middle of the movie, where a character that we assumed one thing about turns out to be something else. And another movie about obsession and idealization and fantasy. Another significant work is, if you guys remember, the 1990s television program Twin Peaks, directed by David Lynch and Mark Frost, which was another murder mystery, although one with some even more bizarre turns, that focused on also a character named Laura, who has been murdered. And as the murder investigation goes underway, we come to understand that the various people in this character's orbit have all developed sort of obsessions with her, or she's become a sort of object of fantasy for all of them. So, David Lynch, who is one of the makers of the series, has cited Laura as a favorite film, and the murdered character is named Laura Palmer, which many take to be, a direct reference to Gene Tierney's character. Yeah.
The thing I think interesting, and what Jonathan said to me made me think particularly of Vertigo, more so than these other examples. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that in Vertigo, Jimmy Stewart is obsessed with one woman and is transforming another, or at least for a time, we think it's another. And here that function is sort of split, right? Because Waldo is the one who transforms Laura into this person that the other people become obsessed with, but it's McPherson, the detective, who really has that sort of, who's in a place of kind of unique service or responsibility, which makes his obsession with her, as opposed to Waldo's, all the more kind of, forbidden or scandalous, which is kind of how it was with Jimmy Stewart and Vertigo. So I always find it interesting when functions of a protagonist are either split or combined from film to film, and I think that's kind of what's happening here.
Yeah, I just want to mention there's one point that Jonathan made that I don't want to let go without mentioning, which is Jonathan made the Pygmalion comparison, which is, I think, a very relevant one, and helps us sort of understand, I think, the nature of Waldo's relationship and his fascination with Laura. I see we have some other hands though. So.
Yeah, Robin, you've had your hand up for a while.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Robin.
Okay. Hi, how are you? I found it interesting, and tell me if anybody else did, the age difference between Waldo and Laura. Was that something that was common back then in the movies, or just particular to this movie?
It was pretty common to see that, and I think particularly with the sort of Pygmalion or Svengali dynamic, it makes it all the more it's all the more common with that. But yeah, I mean, it's been one of the knocks on Hollywood sort of forever is the difference in age between the leading man and the leading lady. Webb isn't exactly the traditional leading man, but I don't think that would have seemed so out of place, particularly given the dynamic. But Jacob, your thoughts?
Well, I have maybe a different take, which is, yes, certainly it was not uncommon for the male stars to be quite a bit and sometimes significantly older than the female stars. Somebody mentioned Bogart and Bacall in The Big Sleep earlier, and I don't know if Bogart was as much older than Lauren Bacall as Clifton Webb was, but he was quite a bit older. But one thing that strikes me is when you see Bogart and Bacall, their age difference doesn't feel quite as acute as it does in this film. I think this film really accentuates this sort of difference, and I don't know. It's one of the ways, for me at least, it's one of the ways that the film complicates the relationship between Waldo and Laura. Where it seems to be something other than just a purely romantic longing or a purely, sensual longing. There's some other dynamics to it, the Pygmalion being one of them. Yeah.
Thanks.
Dana, you've had your hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Dana.
Hi there, guys. Yeah, I want to take a different tack here and come back to Waldo. First of all, I just want to talk about how this is, I had not seen this before, but to me, this was classic film noir. And I loved it for that reason. There were so many elements in it that stood out and made it very, very film noir. The idea of the femme fatale. Actually, she didn't start out seeming like a femme fatale, but she became one, the Jean Tierney character. Certainly the hard-boiled detective. I'm talking about the characters less now, and as opposed to just the cinematic things like the wonderful window shades and the color and the black and white. But in terms of character, they were such stylized characters. They were so stereotypical, and as is often the case in noir, they're sort of all ugly. There's something kind of very unpleasant about film noir movies. They're ugly movies. The people are very non-likable. Having said that, the Waldo character was extremely troubling to me for another reason. He was very stereotypical too, but in addition to being a stereotypical mean and unpleasant guy, I thought uncomfortably that he was a stereotypical homosexual, particularly stereotypical in the 1940s era, where he was painted as kind of a dirty guy. There was obviously no sex going on. The bathtub thing sort of presented that to me, where he allowed himself to be seen naked, off camera, of course, but it sort of established him as a man that wanted to be seen by another man. And as time went on, I thought, of course he's going to be the villain, because in the 40s, that would be a logical thing, to make the homosexual type of character a villain. I found that to be really uncomfortable, particularly coming from it in our day and age, where we thankfully have come such a long way. But nevertheless, there was that about him. The other thing that I didn't see him so much as a Svengali, but I also saw him as a bit of a pedophile. And when he latched onto that young girl and made her attractive, the age difference was very clearly an important part of that. And one of the reputations that homosexuals had in those days was that they were pedophiles. So that part of this, in terms of a noir film, that was like an element of the noir that was particularly uncomfortable for me, but it was also in keeping with what I think a noir film should be. And for that reason, I found it very, very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about noir is it's really the sort of the first time that Hollywood is depicting these characters and depicting a world where really the films are saying, you know, the world can be a terrible place and that it's filled with terrible people. Hollywood, of course, had always had villains, but as you said, Dana, they rarely, if ever, probably never had movies on a consistent basis where everyone or almost everyone was in some way a bad character or had some deep flaw. And while I think that there are plenty of things about Waldo that make him an unsavory fellow, aside from the era's very problematic depiction of his homosexuality, I do think he's depicted as unsavory in such a way that those two become almost inextricable, kind of in a way, you know, similar to Peter Lorre as Joel Cairo in Maltese Falcon. He's another character coded as homosexual. He's not, frankly, I don't think as nearly as unpleasant or nasty of a character, but he's technically a villain as the film defines it, and he's clearly marked as homosexual, at least as much as Webb's character is. And so this is something the genre does. This is something the industry does to an extent. And I guess the only sort of saving grace, and you kind of mentioned this, Dana, is that at least there's plenty of unsavoriness to go around to many, if not all, the characters. So that's a bit better, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One thing that this film gets, criticized for a lot is like indulging in this sort of period trope of like the villainous, gay character. But as Andrew mentioned, I mean, one of the things that we should probably talk about is, Waldo's sort of masculinity is held up against the sort of more traditional stoic masculinity of Detective McPherson, played by Dana Andrews. But it's worth questioning, how savory is his, is his identity, or are there things about his identity that make us, or about that character that make us raise our eyebrows a little bit?
Well, in a way, it's kind of interesting, right? Because we talked about how the film kind of changes in the middle, and two things sort of happen that make it change in the middle, or I guess one thing happens that makes it change, and then the change manifests itself in different ways. One is Laura comes back, but then the movie sort of stops being told to us basically from or through Waldo and starts being told to us, I think, more from McPherson's perspective. And it's interesting that when Waldo's telling the story, to me anyway, McPherson seems like a much better man, a better character than he does once we see McPherson sort of through his own eyes, or more directly, I guess is a better way to say it. And frankly, that I was happy to see that turn, because I for one, and those of you who took the film noir class we had going on in March before all this started, won't be surprised to hear me say this, that I don't think this is the most film noir of film noirs out there. I know it's firmly and widely identified as such, but I think part of it, I think it's weak in some of the categories, although I will say that once the second half of the movie came along and I got to see all of McPherson's warts, then I felt a little better, because the protagonist in a film noir can't be the straight arrow that McPherson appeared to be in the first half of the movie. But we've got a bunch of other hands. Neil Minnie, we'll come back to you if you're there. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me this time?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Neil Minnie.
Oh, okay. Hello. No, I was just thinking that I saw the writer, the I forgot it. What was his name? Waldo, the journalist, as asexual, because he was talking about all the fun he was having with Laura, and his favorite evenings were what, Tuesdays and Fridays, when they would sit at home and she would just basically adoringly listen to him. And then you switch immediately to that scene in the rain, which is a classic setting, and he's walking and he sees her in the window with a man, and that's the first time you have something romantic introduced. And that's when he kind of goes nuts.
Yeah, I mean,
And so to me, I felt like it was more an issue of this was his creation. He was obsessed with her and loved her in an obsessive way, but not necessarily in a sexual way.
Yeah.
no, and you make a fair point, and I think that you're right that it's certainly, you know, people have sort of hierarchies of their personality, and it's entirely possible that Waldo's narcissism was his prime directive, and his homo or hetero or whatever sexuality was secondary to that. And I think there's some indication that that was true about this character, and I think that's a good perception on your part. The only other thing I would say is that we're sort of limited here by the era, and a character that is encoded, as we would say, as homosexual, is the asexuality is part of coding him as homosexual, because he can't be actively or overtly homosexual by the standard of the industry at the time. And so his lack of sort of sexual interest in her or romantic interest in her is part of the way he is depicted or coded as homosexual. But your point about that not being a priority for him one way or the other, I think is a good one.
Yeah, indeed. It's striking that at the end, when, you know, she seems to be going off with the detective, he says, "I'm sure you'll have a very earthy relationship," you know, as if, you know,
Physical contact is sort of unsavory in general.
right. Yeah.
Ashley has a question or comment. Ashley, if you unmute yourself, we can hear your question.
So I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey there.
So one of the questions I had was about film noir and to what degree this film actually fit in that mold, because I think one of you asked the question before about whether or not this was a film noir or what genre it was, but it seems to me like some of the things that film noirs have, it does not have. So like one of the things that we expect in a film noir is the main character to be, you know, this tragic character, and it's a male that we respect in some respects. Whereas another thing that we find is that the character who is like the evil or the black hat is fairly clear from the beginning as well. And I don't think that happened in this film either. I mean, I think this film made a lot of gestures to try to make Waldo not look like the one who was the killer.
I mean, I'm sorry, did you have more?
The last thing I would just say is that although other people may have thought that Laura's character was a femme fatale, I didn't get that sense at all. In fact, I didn't think there was, I mean, she was a little bit too wholesome, if anything, to ever be a femme fatale. So.
Well, so that's a really interesting point, right? I think I mean, she's not Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. She's not even Mary Astor in Maltese Falcon, but we had this discussion when it came to The Postman Always Rings Twice, which we showed and was part of the film noir course shortly before we were ordered to close. And the sort of debate about that was, you know, if you watch that film, you know, she really, you know, in Double Indemnity and even in Maltese Falcon, those femmes fatales are getting the ball rolling on the crimes, and they are involved in planning it and executing it, and, you know, are prime operators in it. In, you know, in Postman Always Rings Twice, the argument was made, and I don't fully agree with it, the argument was made was that, you know, murder doesn't really come up as an option until John Garfield recommends it, and all the other things that 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 Lana Turner wants are reasonable, normal things for a woman in her situation to want. And my response to that was, I think part of the point of film noir is that a femme fatale doesn't, we think of it, and historically it is, and the most sort of potent examples are this sort of, character who is dangerous and is a menace and uses her sexuality to get men to do what she wants, and what she wants are always bad things. But I think there's another element to it, and one that's in a way makes the character a bit more problematic for the time, and in a way insidious, and that is that even if her plans aren't malicious and aren't evil, and she's not sort of a full-blown criminal, the fact that she is so attractive, desirable, sexual, whatever you want to call it, that she makes men want to do these things. Now, it's the man's fault, don't get me wrong, but she is so unbelievable. I mean, we don't think, for example, in Postman, that John Garfield, every diner he went to, he tried to kill the owner because he thought every waitress was as desirable as Lana Turner. No, there was something exceptional about her. And so my point for Laura is that I agree that she doesn't fit that sort of Barbara Stanwyck, Mary Astor mold. And I think she's frankly probably one of the most kind of, fair-minded, well-behaving femme fatales you'll see. And in that sense, she doesn't fit the mold. But the fact that whatever it is about her, whatever her qualities are, whether she wields them intentionally or not, that she gets all these men to do all these things, is a way in which she fits that mold. And again, it's the fault of the men, and it's the flaws of the men, and that's as important a part of the movie as anything. But I think that's one way in which she can be seen as she's such an exceptional female, whatever it is about her, she looks good in a portrait, whatever it is, that she makes men be willing to do these things. And in that way, she plays the part. Okay, and no one has any response to that. Then let's see. Jill, do we have any any questions from the chat?
No questions, but to what you were just discussing, Roseanne just had a comment that for her, Laura was a woman of the times, a career woman who made her own decisions, took care of herself in spite of what Waldo wanted for her, and no one could control her.
I think that's true. And believe it or not, at the time, that would have made her an exception to at least Hollywood's rules. Emmeline, I see you have a question or comment.
Yes, I absolutely loved Jean Tierney. I thought she was fabulous, but I thought she played the role more as an ingenue than as a woman who climbed her way to the very, very top of a Madison Avenue firm. I just couldn't, I didn't buy that. I thought she acted in a way that was, very sort of innocent. And so I had trouble with that.
Yeah. One thing that I think, we should mention when we talk about Laura too, is there's really two Lauras in the movie, right? There's this Laura that we see in the first half of the movie, which is a remembered Laura, or an idealized Laura, a Laura through, mostly through Waldo's eyes, but also the Laura that other people, recount, and that Detective McPherson sort of starts to imagine. Then we see this other Laura appear, the one who actually shows up in the flesh. So I'm curious, too, whether you felt like, whether all y'all felt like those two different versions of Laura lined up, or whether they were different, or how they compared.
Well, I would just say, while people might be thinking about that, in response to what Emmeline was saying, that I think it's a really good point, and I agree with it. And I think of the point of comparison, someone like Joan Crawford and Mildred Pierce, who starts out as a relatively, she's Joan Crawford, so she can't ever be too innocent, naive, but she starts out as a relatively naive and innocent waitress, and then becomes this you know, proprietor of multiple restaurants and this sort of sharp-elbowed businesswoman, and you see that transformation and you buy it. And I agree that it's harder to see here, and I think that you know, I think excuse me, I think part of that probably has to do with, you know, maybe a limitation of how Preminger saw the character and how much he thought a character would change. But I think it's an interesting observation. I also think that we need to wonder about how we see Laura, right? If we agree, and I don't know that we do, but if we agree that the first part of the story is sort of told through Waldo's eyes and the second part is told through McPherson's eyes, then there's a case to be made. We're never sort of actually seeing Laura as Laura is. We might only ever see Laura as those men see her, in which case the depiction of her as described, I think accurately by Emmeline, makes a lot more sense. Let's see. Daphne, do you have another question or comment?
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering kind of who transformed who, and that kind of goes back to what you were saying about whether there were two different Lauras, because Laura does show up at the restaurant and she's a career lady. I don't, and she's a go-getter, and she was beautiful from the beginning. And I didn't really, what I didn't buy necessarily was why she would like the other characters in the film. Like, I didn't really understand why she really personally would have a relationship, a romantic relationship with any of the other men in the movie. But in terms of her being kind of great on her own, she seemed like, I know that Clifton Webb wanted to say that he made her, but it seemed to me that she was going to make herself one way or the other.
No, I mean, I think that's a fair point. And I think that, again, I think that we can ask ourselves about the sort of veracity of the, you know, the perspective we have and of the characterization of Laura. I would also say that, and this is a bit unfortunate, but I would also say that I think that if you look at a lot of movies from particularly the 40s, but also the 50s, and you really start to ask yourself, why is this woman with that man? You're going to find yourself not having very many good answers. It's a kind of a weakness of Hollywood storytelling at the time that, you know, to an extent, a man has to have a woman, but definitely that a woman has to have a man, and that the biggest challenge a woman can face is which man to choose. It's kind of like an inherent flaw in, it's a limitation that the stories have, and sometimes they pay better attention to make the case that the woman really does have a tough choice to make and she should want both of these men. But I have to agree with you that it's a bit challenging, which leads us actually to a character we haven't talked much about, which is the character, of course, played by Vincent Price. And I'm wondering if people have thoughts on him and how he figures into the story. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I know hands are up. I'm not sure what people wish to comment on. So I guess we'll just go back to the hands, and hopefully people have something to say about Price. Fabiano, what's your comment? Okay. Fabiano, are you there? No? Okay. Jonathan.
Well, I didn't raise my hand, but as long as you ask.
Oh, I guess it's still raised from before. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just thinking about Vincent Price's role. I mean, he wasn't as prominent a character as certainly as Waldo, who dominates everything. I wonder if he wasn't used in some ways as misdirection. I mean, he was a serious suspect in whatever murder happened to take place. He certainly had motive and opportunity and all the usual things that a murderer is supposed to have. And I wonder if that just wasn't to draw our attention away from Waldo, just to keep things going.
I mean, I think that's part of it. I also think, you know, there's, you know, if part of the plot of the film is going to revolve around Laura having a choice to make, you want those choices to be distinctive choices. And while, as I said before, I don't think either of them is a particularly winning choice, they certainly are very different choices. Charles, did you have thoughts on the Vincent Price character? No. Oh,
If you don't mind.
Go ahead, Charles.
I thought it was kind of curious that they used the little baseball game puzzle to symbolize Dana Andrews' nonchalant attitude toward murder. He said, several times, it was just another Dane, which Clifton took the wrong way 100 times. But the symbology of it, using that baseball game, I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting detail. And it figures in a couple ways. I mean, first of all, we see him use it as a sort of technique, There's a scene I remember in particular where Waldo starts sort of talking at him and trying to play him, and he, picks up the baseball game almost to shut him down. But I think, it's significant also that it kind of links McPherson or Dana Andrews to this sort of different milieu, He's not the character who is the arch aesthete, who attends classical music concerts, He's tied to baseball, to this sort of this kind of traditional everyman's, sort of version of American masculinity. So I mean, I think that's a little bit of a shorthand for us as well, at least the way I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very efficient way to draw a stark contrast between him and Waldo, especially when he's keeping, he's pretty much keeping his own counsel for the first half of the film. We don't really know much of what McPherson thinks or what he's doing. And I guess in some weird way, for the parlance of the time, it may even be a way of suggesting that he is a way of asserting his heterosexuality, that not just the fact that he's interested in sports, but that he's interested in low culture and things where people sweat and get dirty, which obviously never appeared to Waldo.
Yeah, it also gives Preminger a way to show that, to indicate to the audience when his sort of stoicism and detachment kind of breaks, as his obsession to Laura deepens, because there becomes a point where he can't sort of distract himself or anchor himself, with that game. And it's as he, and that comes around the time that we see him starting to get drawn into this, obsessive fantasy of Laura too.
I've seen some questions a bit about the, I see a few questions in the chat. One of them about sort of the issues around the making of the film. As some of you may know, this was based on a novel, and the novelist spent a while trying to adapt this for other formats. Interestingly, her first thought was to make it a play, and the person she was working on making it a play with on Broadway was Otto Preminger. Preminger had worked for Fox previously. He had an early run in films with Fox as a producer, and was not one of Zanuck's favorites, and his contract wasn't renewed. And so, like a lot of people in film, he went to the theater, and he was more successful in theater, and he was working with the author of the novel to turn this into a play, and he had all these ideas that she wasn't very much interested in, and they would have, having to do with structure and other characters and things like that. So she sort of gave up on the idea of a play and then decided to go back to the movies. And by the time it's funny, there weren't that many studios that were interested, only two, if I recall, being Fox, who ended up making it, an MGM. And it's funny because by the time it worked its way up through Fox, Preminger was back working at Fox. But I think, Jacob, you said initially only as a producer, right?
I'm sorry, say again. I was looking at the chat.
Preminger was initially only a producer, right? On the film.
Correct. Yes, it was attached to Mamoulian, and then I think it went through another step, and then Preminger wanted the project the whole time, but he was unable to get close to it for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, Zanuck was sort of one of those, you're never going to direct in this town again
Yeah.
sort of things. But they made the investment, started the production, and as much as Zanuck didn't like Preminger, for whatever reason, and I don't know the reason, excuse me, he really didn't like what Mamoulian was doing. So they changed, they changed sets, they changed a whole bunch of things when Preminger took over directing for Mamoulian. I think it's sort of one of those instances where, the basketball team is really, really unhappy with the coach, but there's no other coach out there they really want anymore. So the GM says, all right, I'll fire the coach and then I'll coach myself. And then all of a sudden it sort of ends up being a pretty good season. And I think that's kind of what happened here.
Yeah. One of the notable changes too, that, took place over, the many changes of hands, was that I believe that initially Waldo's part was much smaller and Laura's part was much bigger. She was, she has a big presence in this film, but she's just that, a presence rather than an actual character for much of it. My understanding is that in earlier drafts, she was in the film more, and what occurred to Preminger, and I think was an original and effective change, was that the Waldo character should be bigger, and that Laura, the character, was almost more powerful as a sort of phantom, or as a sort of in her absence than she was, when she appeared. Yeah.
And in that regard, it reminded me of Rebecca.
Yeah.
Which, of course, excuse me, is all the more interesting when Dame Judith Anderson shows up in a part that seemed really odd for her. But that's another story. Janet, I see you have a question.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to definitely talk about Dame Judith Anderson because she's so great. And so I like that segue from Rebecca to here. Yeah, Laura really is kind of, wouldn't you say, a composite of the male desire and gaze. And then the relationship with Anne and Vincent Price, Shelby, is kind of a bit parallel to Laura and Waldo, but maybe not. I like the idea that it was considered to be a play at first. I think it would be a great play because the only important set really was the apartments. Well, the three apartments. Don't have a bigger, huge point here. I was kind of confused at first at the title. I had forgotten. I thought we were going to be watching Out of the Past because I remember the female character's name was so important, but of course it was Kathy, not Laura. But Out of the Past is really dark. But while I have the chance, I wanted to say you guys are doing such an amazing job at keeping us engaged and everything that you've been doing with emails has been terrific outreach. So yay to you.
Well, thanks very much for that. We have to give credit to our colleagues, our art director, Heather Rosenfeld, also without whose help we wouldn't be having these discussions because she figured out the tech pretty much all by herself in like a day. Gina Izzo, our director of marketing, has a lot to do with how those emails look as well. So we appreciate that good feedback. Regarding your point about the film, Janet, I think that's a really interesting one, the sort of parallel, the way that, and I can't remember the characters' names, but the way Anderson's and Price's sort of dynamic is similar to the one between Waldo and Laura, although of course, I think Dame Judith makes it very clear that she's sexually interested in Price. I mean, she touches him every chance she gets, where I don't think we see Waldo. We may not see Waldo touch Laura once, even in a casual way. But that's a very interesting dynamic, and I think one worth really thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob, did you have any final thoughts as we're getting close to the hour mark.
Yeah, I just want to raise sort of one more question about an important scene that we talked around, but we haven't talked a lot. What do you guys think of the scene where Laura actually reappears? You know, it's shot in an interesting way.
I really agree, and I want to hear other people's thoughts before, I don't want to just take all the time. But Ken, did you have a thought on that scene where Laura reappears? Ken? Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, now we can.
Hey.
Sorry about this picture, folks. I have to fix that. I thought it was fascinating that McPherson was spending so much time in her apartment. It almost gives you the idea that from almost the minute he walks in, he becomes obsessed. And then she walks in while he's going through her things.
Yeah, he's really making himself at home when she shows up, right?
Yeah.
Are there other people have thoughts on that? I saw some hands go up when that question came up. Hunter, did you have a thought on Laura's reappearance? Hunter? Okay. Zach, did you have thoughts on Laura's reappearance?
Yeah. I mean, you could interpret like everything that happened beyond that as a dream. You could, McPherson apparently like is now famous for taking down this gangster in this very violent scene. So, he could have descended into alcoholism, and then he just had some very weird fever dream for the rest of the movie.
No, I think that was my impression. Like, I totally thought that was a dream. And when Jacob's talking about the way it was shot, Jacob, you must have had some ideas about the specifics of the way it looked.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, we see him, the way it's shot, we see him fall asleep in front of her portrait. The camera pushes in on him. Then it pulls back out and she walks in the door. And there's a version of this film, this would be like really a sort of conventional film grammar is, we see the scene play out and then suddenly it cuts back to him in the chair going, huh, and it's all a dream. That doesn't happen. We see it play out to the end. But you can't sort of shake that feeling that sort of, there's this, I saw somebody mention this in the chat. Is this McPherson's fantasy? Well, I don't know. I mean, we don't see him wake up for it, but it has that sort of undercurrent, and it's preceded by the scene of him walking around the apartment, going through her clothes, smelling her perfume, reading her letters, staring at her portrait. It's interesting too that, I encourage you to go back and see if you can find that scene where he's in her apartment on YouTube and pay attention to how many mirrors he walks past, because as he's going through her stuff, we also see him looking into his own reflection quite a bit. So.
No, I mean, frankly, if it were a dream, to me, it would make the film a lot more credible in a way. I think, as you said, the film language is telling us it's a dream, but also the fact that she sort of automatically falls for him, which is a way that romance happened in a lot of Hollywood movies of the period. They don't typically, she's a woman of this type, he's a man of that type, that should be good enough for us. I don't care for that personally, but a lot of movies do it. Movies that aren't trying to, suggest it might be a dream. But I think there's that dynamic. I think his sudden and random realization about the shotgun in the bottom of the clock and why he breaks the first clock. He breaks the first clock. I think there's a lot of things to sort of.
Machina. Yeah.
What were you gonna say?
I said it's like a Deus Ex Machina, and then somebody just popped up in the chat and said the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just, one way to make that to me a bit more palatable is if it just sort of came to him sort of subconsciously in a dream. I don't think we're meant to think that the movie's a dream, but in a way, I would find it a lot more interesting if it were. Janice, do you have a question or comment on this front?
It's actually not necessarily on what you're talking about now, but something that hasn't been talked about at all, which struck me through a good part of the movie, which is the lack of it being a crime scene. There, even back then, I think you would have had yellow tape, some semblance of trying to keep a crime scene fresh and not disturb it. And here the very detective is going through the things, and then he finally, when he finds the gun, puts a handkerchief around it. You know, very, very vain attempt at keeping a crime scene. And somebody was shot there, no blood, none of that. So that maybe it's appropriate for the times, but it was something I thought about frequently during the film.
No, I mean, I think that's a fair point. And also the fact that, you know, he brings Waldo with him to talk to witnesses and
oh yeah.
That was really, really kind of odd. And
yes.
Yeah, come on, man, tag along.
And I mean, I agree with you, Janice, that you know, even by the standard of the time, there should have been a bit more of a nod towards sort of police procedure. And I think if the film wants to say it's a movie that's not going to care about that, then why do we have all the handkerchief stuff at the end? So I agree with you. That was a bit of a flaw in the film.
But you talked about before that it was going to have possibly been a play. And I think things would have been treated like that more likely in a play than in a movie.
No, they're different.
Very casually.
There are different expectations and different standards of realism. I think that's true. But I think, you know, once they committed to it, I mean, it's not like they used the play version for the screenplay. I mean,
exactly.
it was redone. So they have some obligation to kind of, you know, do their due diligence, so to speak. A couple people still have hands up that we didn't hear from. Ken, are you there now? Okay, what about Hunter?
Hey, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Hunter.
Hey, so as for the ending, I mean, it is kind of interesting that kind of, you know, for the first half of the movie, McPherson is our vehicle to meet all of these other characters and kind of see their, you know, their version of what happened and who Laura was as a person. But by the time we reached that like 44-minute mark, we are entirely in McPherson's world, wandering around the apartment. And I think, you know, even though characters have called attention to how thorough he's being, it's the first time we really see how creepy it is and how intimate, you know, it's becoming for him. And I think, I mean, for me, the zoom in to his face and then zoom out to reveal the portrait and then the real Laura, like almost functions to show that we're going to see her and everything else from his perspective from this point on in the movie. It's kind of, you know, a way to realign our perception and, you know, and our focus going forward. But pardon me if I'm mistaken, but wasn't there an ending where it was revealed that it was all kind of a fantasy? There was some sort of reshoot that I think Zanuck, you know, Zanuck wanted to reshoot the ending and they wound up not going with it. But potentially, you know, was it all of a dream at the end? I don't know.
I don't know what the content of the dream was. All I know is that I read as well that that was the case, and that actually Zanuck had a screening of the alternate ending that he ordered shot at Fox, and he had his buddy Walter Winchell watch it with him. And the reshoot that he ordered made the movie so confusing for Winchell that Zanuck said, "All right, forget my idea for the reshoot. Go with what you had originally, which is what we see." So I don't know the nature of that reshoot, but it obviously didn't make things clearer, at least not for a news person or a columnist anyway, like Winchell. Let's see. Any other last chance? Ken, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Hey, Ken.
I thought that ending, first of all, it was a startling ending. I was expecting at the end for her to swoon in McPherson's arms, and you're expecting them to live happily ever after, yet it was just such a stark ending that I was kind of like surprised, which is, I hadn't even thought about the dream sequence, whether or not that's an element of this. But I was surprised that they didn't have a happy ending because I kind of expected it.
Jacob, you have thoughts on that? I mean,
well, I mean, I think it ends. We can see by the way it ends what Preminger is really making the film about. You know, the note that he chooses to close on, and its obsession. You know, it ends with you know, Waldo's sort of toxic obsession with Laura being carried to its, you know, farthest extremity and ultimately annihilating him. And that's the taste that, you know, we leave the film. You know, we leave with that, you know, taste in our mouth. And I think that speaks to kind of what Preminger is really interested in. You know, more so, yeah. I was just going to say more so than the romantic narrative, which also, you know, is a thread of the film.
I mean, I think it's clear that the two of them end up together, at least as the film ends. But Waldo has to die. He has to be punished for the crime that he committed, not only in sort of the general morality of the time, but in the sort of censorship codes of the time. He couldn't get away with what he did. So that's why he had to meet a violent end. Speaking of violent ends, we've gone a bit over an hour. I think maybe we should call this to an end. Hopefully it wasn't a violent one. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for participating. We will have another film announced on Thursday and another discussion a week from tonight. So please sign up for our weekly emails if you haven't, or check out our Film Studies Online page on our website, where you can find out all this information, see what you might have missed from past weeks, and other things. And we appreciate your participation and your engagement with the Film Institute. And if you like what we're doing, you can always certainly make a donation to support our compensating even our part-time in front of house staff during this closure. We're doing our best to do that and our best to keep you all engaged, and we appreciate your participation. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, guys. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having these.